I want to talk a little bit about some regional and global challenges in the region. Security challenges, I guess we probably, if we had taken this lecture back a couple of years, this probably would not have been on this list. But as a result, I think, of obvious tensions on the Korean Peninsula, as a result of, I think, a much more assertive position that China is taking on the South China Sea claims. These claims have been out there for generations, but it's only been in recent years where I think the Chinese have been much, much more assertive. And of course, it's been an issue that has gained a lot more public and international attention. So we now talk about security issues to a certain extent the same way we did maybe 20 or 30 years ago. And again, the United States is critically involved in these issues because of sea lanes access, because of our defense relationship with Japan, our cooperative relationship with governments like the Philippines, and of course the fact that if North Korea does launch some kind of a missile, it'll be not only disruptive, I think, to the whole neighborhood, but obviously to our own interests as well. One of the challenges for the United States is to try to reassure people that our focus on Asia is not an attempt to isolate China or deny China its aspirations for, economic prosperity of its people or its natural place in the family of nations. And I would argue that I think that the United States has pursued a very active policy of engagement with the People's Republic of China from 1979. And it's only been within the last couple of years or so that I think, for a whole variety of reasons, which I think my colleagues will go into tomorrow, the Chinese have really had a much, much more assertive stance. And that really includes, of course, doing something about territorial disputes with Japan, territorial disputes, I think, in the South China Sea area as well. So the relationship with China in economic terms, in political, regional security terms, is a major concern.
2005, I published an article by a Chinese scholar from Beijing University. The topic of that article is learning to live with hegemon. That was the attitude of China. We don't like America to be a dominant power. We don't like America as a hegemonic power. However, that's a reality. So we had to live with this reality to make policy adjustments, adaptation to the reality. That was the attitude for quite a while. US sold weapons to Taiwan. We don't like it, but we cannot stop it. We just protested. Now, when Obama came to office, 2009, China began to change, said, now you have to stop. It's time for you to stop that. I remember that time was so clear. They told Obama very, very clearly. And when Obama told them, this is what the US has been done for a long time, they said, now your position and our relationship has changed. In the past, was the US imposed sanctions on China. Now China will have the power, will have the leverage to put sanctions on your companies, on US companies. In fact, a Chinese military officer, Admiral, two-star Rear Admiral, he wrote an article at that time, said, it's time for us to shape US foreign policy choice. to tell them what they can do, they cannot do. Then when North Korea sunk the South Korean ship, Tian'an ship, U.S. and South Korea had a military exercise, joint military exercise in Yellow Sea in China. The USS George Washington aircraft carrier was going to enter that Yellow Sea. For the first time, China said, no, you cannot come. You cannot come this time. You will hear those stories. China's relationships with its neighbors has been really deteriorated in the last few years. China, for quite a while, never included South China Sea, those islands, and East China Sea island with Japan as so-called core national interests. Now China has been very clear. They are part of our core national interests. When I say core national interest, meaning no negotiable. You cannot negotiate with us. It's ours. And for quite a while, China was carried out a policy of putting aside of the sovereignty dispute. Let's have a joint development. Now it's no longer putting aside, denying those disputes. Now this time it's for us to claim the sovereignty so clearly. Several factors, I think, could be counted when we talk about China's change of behavior. First of all is the rising power position. It's so clear economically. China is now second largest economy, and politically China has maintained its stability, although there are a lot of domestic problems, state in power. And diplomatically, China has been very influential in the world. Militarily, China has, after 30 years of military modernization, China has built a blue ocean navy. China has its own aircraft carrier. The first one, China is building, second, the third. I mean, this afternoon, my next speaker may tell you more those stories. So China did become more confident now.
We should not assume that the Chinese armed forces are organized and structured in the same way or have capabilities similar to and intentions similar to the United States or NATO forces, nor will they likely fight like us, nor do they have doctrine that is the same as ours, and nor are their personnel up to the same technical standard as a general rule as our forces. And what I would like, the one policy recommendation I would make right now is, in this regard, we should not try to mirror image the Chinese and see them as a reflection of ourselves or perhaps of the older Soviet forces, which they were modeled on for many years. The structure of the PLA is quite different from the United States. It really still is a ground-centric, army-focused force because traditionally China has been a continental power. And it's really only in the past 10, 15 years that they've started looking to expand their naval's reach much beyond their coastal waters and started to think about having a maritime strategy. They right now do not have an officially published maritime strategy for the nation. Every unit from company all the way up to military region has both a commander and a political commissar that share responsibility for everything that unit does or does not do. Perhaps the most important underlying principle of the Chinese defense modernization is that defense modernization is subordinate to, but for the past 15 years, coordinated with China's main goal of national economic development. And they understand that deterrence requires three elements. The first element is having a capable force, a capable military force. You can't bluff. You have to actually have forces to be able to do the things that you're talking about. The second element of deterrence is that you have to display the determination to use that force. They do that through exercises, equipment tests, all sorts of ways. And then finally, the third element of deterrence is to, what I say, ping the other side, to make sure that the other side knows that they understand what you're doing. And so deterrence is all in the mind of those to be deterred. It's a big psychological game. You know, they might be able to push around the Philippines or Vietnam, maybe even Japan, but when that enemy is backed by the United States, their calculations change dramatically. But going back to Sun Tzu, China would prefer to accomplish its objectives without war, to win battles without fighting is the acme of success, so said Sun Tzu.
The normalization of relations with Vietnam from the U.S. perspective was more about us, our coming to grips with the war and the legacy. In Myanmar, I would contend that the United States is not even that relevant to what's happening in Vietnam, thanks to our past policies and disinterest, and that's a polite word, disinterest. However, what is going on there in Myanmar, their attempts to come to grips with modernity and democracy should interest all of us. On press freedom, there are 2 million individual bloggers in Vietnam. Vietnam ranks number 18 in number of people online around the world, and Vietnam has the fastest growing number of people on Facebook. But government oppression is on the increase. Show trials are popping up. People are being thrown in jail. People are being thrown in jail for blogging or for organizing demonstrations against the Chinese activity in the South China Sea. But the bottom line, actually, with respect to China and Vietnam, is balance. China is not going away. China is going to always be the neighbor to the north, and it's a very big neighbor to the north, and it dominates economically as well as politically. So the normalization of relations really took place because the Vietnamese took the decision to normalize with us. And they took that decision in the late 80s, early 90s. You know, when the Soviet Union collapsed and the political support and their economy was going down, they made the very rational decision they got to change their ways, and they decided to reach out to the U.S. And the overtures took a while, but it culminated in the political normalization on July 11, 1995. Myanmar is endowed with enormous natural resources. Peace. China is the big question. And I think China is part of why Myanmar did reach out to the United States, because there was a feeling that China, there was too much there. I mean, the northern half of the country, the Chinese presence is palpable. In 2009, I went to Kachin State for a New Year festival, and in Machina, the capital, half the license plates were from Yunnan province. And I went to the site of the dam that the Myanmar government turned down, Mitson Dam, which at the headwaters of the Irrawaddy, which is, the most sacred body of river in the country. But on the way there, we saw land on both sides of the road raised, where they eliminated villages, and they built then, new towns, but they made people move. And then we saw these camps where the workers were going to be, and the worker and all the language and all the signs at the camp were in Chinese, because they were bringing in Chinese workers to build these dams. They were not hiring any Burmese or Kachin, and the power was all going to Yunnan province. So it was just ultimately, a bridge too far. obviously, for the government. The people in government today will concede to you publicly that Aung San Suu Kyi will win the election at this point in 2015. Now, the Constitution has to be reformed in order for her to be able to run, because the present Constitution does not allow anyone who was married to a foreigner to be on the ballot. She has to reach an accommodation with the military, because the military controls the majority of the votes, and they have to be comfortable with her in order to let her have this concession.
But if, God forbid, Japanese airplanes are shot down or shot at, if, God forbid, a Japanese Coast Guard cutter, or even worse, a Japanese Navy ship, finds itself in an armed clash with the PLA, or one of the, unfortunately, still 17 various maritime agencies that are armed in China, if in that event, then under the Mutual Defense Treaty, Japan and the U.S. will consult, and Japan can ask us to formally involve some level of American military support. So, that's the risk in the Senkakus, that something would happen involving Japanese forces, Chinese forces, and the Japanese would ask us to join them. That's the risk there. The risk in North Korea, with the Korean Peninsula, is a little bit different in that, as I'm sure you've looked at the map, North and South Korea are connected to each other by land. We still have troops on the ground in South Korea, and I'm sure you've seen the North Koreans still have anywhere up to 10,000 artillery pieces right in the mountains on the DMZ. They don't need nukes to destroy Seoul. They could do it in an afternoon. What the hell do we do when the North Koreans have now made it abundantly clear they are not going to ever negotiate away their nuclear weapons? So any negotiations we have with them are going to be about the terms of normalization and the terms of a peace treaty. And Obama is saying, probably correctly, I'm not going to negotiate with you except about denuclearization. Okay? Because if I am prepared to negotiate with you about, a peace treaty, or even just a moratorium on testing, then I am accepting you as an existing nuclear power, and I am not going to do that. Well, that sounds great, and it's what we're saying about Iran, but they are a nuclear power. The bad news is we really do think that the boy's going to try to do something. Do we think he's crazy? No, we don't. But, he's 28, 29, 30 years old. I don't know about you, but if he's even remotely like me when I was that age, I wouldn't trust me with a damn thing. We just don't know what his reaction is emotionally to being stood up for. We do know that the North Korean system is really geared to be run from the top down. So we're all going, you can't be serious, this guy's not in charge. There's a pretty good chance he's really in charge. So there's a lot of unknowns of dealing with this young man. We kind of knew that his dad understood the red lines. He managed not to commit suicide. He managed not to invade the South. He managed not to fire, we didn't have a nuke that worked, but he managed not to, he actually made a deal with Clinton. We must talk about, at least briefly, and I'm going to anticipate that I was asked it, is aren't the Chinese ever going to finally control the North Koreans, their client? Well, if that could ever have happened, it probably hasn't been true for 15 or 20 years. There is a legendary 3-day period back in the 90s, I think it was, where the Chinese closed down the oil pipeline for maintenance for 3 days. And to this day, they don't admit they just turned it off. Everybody kind of got the message that, if we really wanted to do that, we could do that. But every Chinese person I know, every Chinese official I know says, Chris, the days we might have really exerted the kind of control the American policy is still fundamentally based on, those days are long gone. They don't do what we tell them to do, if we even could try to tell them. And you've seen since China voted for the last 2 sets of UN resolutions, the Chinese are not happy with their fraternal brothers in Pyongyang. They are really not happy. But to this day, the Chinese strategic assessment is that the strategic risk of North Korea remains collapse.
I know we talk about Asia and we talk about foreign policy issues, but to me, the number one issue really has to do with U.S. domestic economy, about getting our own house in order and getting things rolling again. I think sort of the political divisions in Washington, I tell my Washington friends that beyond the Beltway, and I like to say that we now live beyond the Beltway, it looks pretty dysfunctional right here from this particular perspective. And we hope that eventually people on both sides of the aisle in Washington will come together and maybe start moving us in the right direction in terms of what we need to do in our own domestic economic recovery in this particular country. Because the recovery of the U.S. economy has an awful lot to do with the amount of influence that we can bring to bear on other countries in the world and the kind of example that we provide to other countries in the world of what might be the right path in terms of democracy, in terms of economic expansion, in terms of the rule of law and these issues as well. We need to continue to work on improving Asian perceptions of the United States, which I think for a while turned fairly negative. It was interesting that about three and a half years ago in the Washington Post, there was an article based on a survey that had been done in Thailand. And of course, we have a long historic relationship with Thailand. It goes back to 1833, the Treaty of Amity and Commerce. It's the oldest legal relationship we've had with any country in Asia. And Thailand has been our best friend and ally for many, many years. At any rate, in this Washington Post article, they said that an interview asking a number of Thai to say, name Thailand's number one friend, and at that point, the 60% plus of the respondents said China is Thailand's number one friend. And during our day, we did a lot of U.S. Information Service polling, and the United States was always on top of that list, and China was down a list. I suspect the same poll today would show a little bit more skepticism on the part of the Thai public in view of the more assertive sort of foreign policy and economic policy that the Chinese have pursued. But nonetheless, I think it should be sort of a wake-up call that we need to do a better job of getting our message out.
Thank you.